This is a Durkin Hayes audio production.
Myth Directions.
"This place stinks," my scaly mentor snarled, glaring out the window at the rain.
"Yes, Aahz," I agreed meekly.
"What's that supposed to mean?"
he snapped, turning his demon's speckled gold eyes on me. "It means," I gulped, "that I agree with you. The kingdom of Posiltum, and the palace specifically, stink to high heaven, both figuratively and literally. As the court magician to my king, I had already endured a great deal more than I had ever bargained for. Actually, the king of Posiltum isn't my king. I'm his royal magician, an employee at best. Aahz isn't my demon either. I'm his apprentice, trying desperately to learn enough magic to warrant my aforementioned lofty title. Gleep is definitely my dragon, though. Just ask Aahz. Unfortunately, on this particular day, I was cut off from my pet's company. Gleep is too big to live indoors with us, and the rain made the courtyard unpassable, so I couldn't reach the stables where he was quartered."
"There must be something to do,"
Aahz grumbled, begging to pace the floor.
"I haven't been this bored since the 200-year siege."
"You could teach me about dimension travel," I suggested hopefully. This was one area of magic Aahz had steadfastly refused to teach me. As I mentioned earlier, Aahz is a demon, short for dimension traveler.
"If push comes to shove," he yawned, "we can use the D-hopper. As long as we've got a mechanical means of traveling to other dimensions, there's no need for you to learn how to do it magically."
"Come on, Aahz," I exploded. "Why won't you teach me? What makes dimension traveling so hard to learn?"
"There are a few things you've overlooked in your enthusiasm," he intoned dryly. "First of all, remember that in another dimension, you'll be a demon. Now, except for Deva, which makes its money on cross-dimension trade, most dimensions don't greet demons with flowers and red carpets. Now, if we went touring and ran into trouble, what do we have to defend ourselves? I've lost my powers, and yours are still so undeveloped as to be practically non-existent. Who's going to handle the natives?"
There was a soft bamf, and a demon appeared in the room, right there, in my private quarters in the Posiltum Royal Palace. Before I could recover from my surprise, or Aahz could move to intervene, the demon plopped itself onto my lap and planted a big, warm kiss full on my mouth. "Hi, handsome," it purred. "How's tricks?" My temperature went up several degrees. Tanda has that effect on me. Lusciously curvaceous, with a mane of light green hair accenting her lovely olive complexion and features, she could stop a 20-man brawl with a smile and a deep sigh.
"He isn't the only one in the room, you know," Aahz commented dryly.
"Hi, Aahz," my adorable companion cried, untangling herself from my lap and throwing herself into Aahz's arms. What brings you to these parts?" I asked. "It's nothing really," she sighed. "I have a little shopping to do, and was hoping I could borrow one of you two to help me carry things."
"You mean today?"
Aahz frowned. "Actually, for the next couple of days," Tanda informed him. "Maybe as long as a week."
"Well, can't do it," Aahz sighed. "I have to referee a meeting between Big Julie and General Bad Axe tomorrow. Any chance you could postpone it until next week?"
You weren't the one I was thinking of, Aahz," Tanda said, giving the ceiling a casual survey. "I was thinking Skeeve and I could handle it." "Me?" I blinked. Aahz scowled.
"Not a chance," he declared. "The kid can't play step and fetch it for you. It's beneath his dignity."
"No, it isn't. I cried. I mean, if it wouldn't be beneath you, Aahz, how could it be beneath me?
I'm not the court magician of Porceltum,
He argued. I can disguise myself, I countered. That's one of my best spells. You've said so yourself. I think your scaly green mentor is just a little bit jealous, Tanda observed, winking at me covertly.
Jealous? Aahz exploded. Me? Jealous of a little...
He broke off and looked back and forth between Tanda and myself as he realized he was being baited.
Oh, well, I suppose it would be okay, he grumbled at last. Go ahead and take him, even though it's beyond me what you expect to find in this backwater dimension worth shopping for.
Oh, Aahz, Tanda laughed. You're a card. Shopping in Klah? I may be a little flighty from time to time, but I'm not crazy. You mean we're headed for other dimensions? I asked eagerly. Of course, she nodded.
Stop! Aahz shouted. If you think I'm going to let my apprentice go traipsing around the dimensions alone and unprotected...
He won't be alone. I'll be with him. That means he won't be unprotected. Just because I let my membership with the Assassin's Guild expire doesn't mean I've forgotten everything. Come on, Aahz, I pleaded. What could go wrong?
The mind boggles,
he retorted grimly. You have been a little overprotective, haven't you, Aahz? Tanda urged gently. Aahz was silent for several moments, avoiding our eyes.
All right, he sighed at last. Go ahead, kid. Just don't come crying to me if you get yourself killed.
Well, how could I do that? I frowned. Tanda nudged me in the ribs, and I took the hint.
There are a few things I want settled before you go, Aahz declared brusquely, a bit of his normal spirit returning. He began moving back and forth through the room, gathering items from our possessions. First, he announced, here's some money of your own for the trip. You probably won't need it, but you always walk a little taller with money in your pouch.
So saying, he counted out 20 gold pieces into my hands. Gee, Aahz, I began, but he hurried on.
Second, there's the D-hopper.
He tucked the small metal cylinder into my belt.
I've set it to bring you back here. If you get into trouble, if you think you're getting into trouble, hit the button and come home right then. No heroics, no jazzy speeches, just hit and get. You understand me?
Yes, Aahz, I promised dutifully. Tanda smiled. Well, are you ready to go? As ready as I'll ever be, I declared confidently. What's our first stop? The bazaar at Deva? Goodness, no, she retorted, wrinkling her nose. We're after something really unique, not the common stuff they have at the bazaar. I figure we're going to have to hit some out-of-the-way dimensions. The more out of the way, the better. Well, what are we looking for, anyway? Tanda shot a quick glance at the door, then leaned forward to whisper in my ear. I couldn't tell you before, she murmured conspiratorially, but we're after a birthday present. A birthday present for Aahz. As the dimension of Jahk came into focus, it was apparent that we were in a small park, heavily overgrown with trees and shrubs. It was not the flora of the place which caught and held my attention, however. It was the crowd. What crowd, you might ask? Why, the one carrying blazing torches and surrounding us, of course. Oh, that crowd. Well, to be completely honest, they weren't actually surrounding us. They were surrounding the contraption we were standing on. It was some sort of wagon, in that it was large and had 4 wheels. Beyond that, I couldn't tell much about it because it was completely covered by tufts of colored paper. Of all the things that had flashed across my mind when Tanda warned me that the Jahks were weird, the one thing that had not occurred to me was that they were blue and yellow paper freaks.
Get off the float!" This last was shouted at us from someone in the crowd. I beg your pardon," I shouted back. "The float! Get off it!" "Come on, handsome," Tanda hissed, hooking my elbow in hers. Together we leaped to the ground. As it turned out, we were barely in time. With a bloodthirsty howl, the crowd surged forward and tossed their torches onto the contraption we had so recently abandoned. Edging away from the scene, I realized with horror that it was being duplicated throughout the park. Wherever I looked, there were bonfires set on contraptions and jubilant crowds. "I think we arrived at a bad time," I observed. "What makes you say that?" Tanda asked. "Little things," I explained, "like the fact that they're in the middle of torching the town." "I don't think so," my companion shrugged. "When you torch a town, you don't usually start with the parks." "Okay, then you tell me just what they're doing." "As far as I can tell, they're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" "Some kind of victory. As near as I can tell, everyone's shouting, 'We won! We won!'" I surveyed the blazes again. "I wonder what they'd do if they lost." "Time to do something about our disguises," Tanda murmured. The disguises should have been easy. I mean, the Jahks were humanoid, and I had lots of ready models to work from. Unfortunately, I encountered a problem. Despite the teeming masses around us, I couldn't settle on two individuals whose appearances I wanted to duplicate. Every being I could see was extremely off-weight, either over or under. If a specific individual wasn't ribs protruding thin to the point of looking brittle, he was laboring along under vast folds of fat which bunched and bulged at waist, chin, and all four cheeks. Try as I might, I couldn't bring myself to alter Tanda or myself to look like these wretched specimens. I studied the first two individuals my eyes fell on, then concentrated on duplicating their appearance without really considering how they looked. "Not bad," Tanda commented dryly, surveying her new body. "Of course, I always thought I looked better as a woman." "You want a disguise, you get a disguise," I grumbled. "Hey, handsome," my once curvaceous comrade breathed, laying a soft but hairy hand on my arm. "Relax, we're on the same side. Remember?" My anger melted away at her touch, as always. Maybe someday I'll develop an immunity to Tananda's charms. Until then, I'll just enjoy them. Just then, the clamor in the street soared to new heights, drowning out any efforts at individual conversation. A wall-to-wall mob of people was marching down the street, chanting in unison and sweeping along or trampling any smaller groups it encountered. Rather than expressing anger or resentment at this intrusion, the people around us were jumping up and down and cheering, hugging each other with tears of pure joy in their eyes. The focus of everyone's attention seemed to be sitting on a litter, borne aloft by the stalwarts at the head of the crowd. To say they carried a statue would be insufficient. It was the ugliest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was small, roughly twice the size of my head, and depicted a large, four-legged toad holding a huge eyeball in its mouth. Along its back, instead of warts, were torsos, heads and arms of tiny Jahks intertwined in truly grotesque eroticism. These figures were covered with the warty protrusions one would expect to have found on the toad itself. As a crowning touch, the entire thing had a mottled gold finish, which gave the illusion of splotches crawling back and forth on the surface. "That's it," Tanda said with sudden impish glee. "That's what?" I blinked. "Aahz's birthday present," she proclaimed. I peered down the street, wondering what she was looking at. "What is?" I asked. "That statue," she said firmly.
That statue? I cried, unable to hide my horror. Of course, she nodded. It's perfect. Aahz will have never seen one, much less owned one. How do you figure that? I pressed. It's obviously one of a kind, she explained. I mean, who could make something like that twice? She had me there, but I wasn't about to give up the fight. There's just one little problem. I'm no expert on psychology, but if that pack we just saw is any decent sample, I don't think the folks around here are going to be willing to sell us their pretty statue. Of course not, silly, she laughed, turning to her food again. That's what makes it priceless. I never planned to buy Aahz's present. Why do you think it was so important for you to come along on this trip? I mean, you've always said you wanted to be a thief. It was roughly 12 hours later, the start of a new day. The town was deathly still in the early morning light. Apparently everyone was sleeping off the prior night's festivities, which seemed a reasonable pastime, all things considered. We did manage to find one open restaurant, however. The owner was wearily shoveling out the rubble left by the celebrating crowds. Say, could we ask you a couple of questions? Tanda purred. Such as? The man responded listlessly. Such as, where do they keep the statue? She asked bluntly.
Oh, you mean the trophy? The man laughed. Statue? Hey, that's a good one. You two must be new in town.
You might say that, I confirmed dryly. Statue, trophy, what's the difference? Tanda shrugged. Where's it kept?
It's on public display in the trophy building, of course, the owner informed us. We put up a building especially for it. You two must really be new not to know that.
I just got in yesterday, I confirmed. Just to show you how new we are, we don't even know what the trophy's for.
For?
The man gaped.
Why, it's for winning the big game, of course.
What big game? The man sighed.
Look, he said, this land has two potential capitals. One is Vegas, and this one, as you know, is Ta-hoe.
I hadn't known it, but it seemed unwise to admit my ignorance. I'm slow, but not dumb.
Since there can only be one capital at any given time, our host continued, the two cities compete for the privilege each year. The winner is the capital and gets to be the center of government for the next year. The trophy is the symbol of that power, and Vegas has had it for the last 5 years. Yesterday, we finally won it back.
You mean the big game decides who's going to run the land? I exclaimed, realization dawning at last. Excuse my asking, but isn't that a bit silly?
No sillier than any other means of selecting governmental leadership, the man countered, shrugging his bony shoulders. It sure beats going to war. You think it's a coincidence that we've been playing the game for 500 years and there hasn't been a civil war in that entire time?
But if the big game has replaced civil war, then what? I began, but Tanda interrupted. I hate to interrupt, she interrupted. Where did you say the trophy building was again?
1 block up and 6 blocks to the left, our host supplied. You'll know it by the crowds.
As predicted, the trophy building was crowded despite the early hour. As we approached, I marveled anew at the physique of the natives, or specifically the lack thereof. Tanda did not seem to share my fascination with the natives, and threaded her way nimbly through the throng, leaving me to follow behind. Tanda continued making her way closer to the trophy, but I stopped just inside the door. My advantage of height gave me a clear view of the trophy from where I was. If anything, it was uglier seen plainly than it had been viewed from a distance. "Isn't it magnificent?" The woman standing next to me sighed. It took me a moment to realize she was speaking to me. My disguise made me look shorter, and she was talking to my chest. I've never seen anything like it, I agreed lamely. Of course not, she frowned. It's the last work done by the great sculptor Jahk before he went mad. It occurred to me that the statue might have been done after he went mad. Then it occurred to me that it might have driven him mad, especially if he had been working from a live model. I became so lost in the horrible thought that I started nervously when Tanda reappeared at my side and touched my arm. "Let's go, handsome," she murmured. "I've seen enough." The brevity of her inspection gave me hope. "There's no hope, huh?" I sighed dramatically. "Gee, that's tough. I had really been looking forward to testing my skills." "That's good," she purred, taking my arm, "because I think I see a way we can pull this caper off." I wasn't sure what a caper was, but I was certain that once I found out, I wouldn't like it. I was right. "Are you positive there was no lock on the door?" I asked for the 23rd time. "Keep it down," Tanda hissed, laying a soft hand on my lips, though none too gently. "Do you want to wake everybody?" She had a point. We were crouched in an alley across from the trophy building, and as the whole idea of our waiting was to be sure everyone was asleep, it was counterproductive to make so much noise we kept them awake. Still, I had questions I wanted answered. "You're sure?" I asked again in a whisper. "Yes, I'm sure," Tanda sighed. "Well, I don't like it," I declared suspiciously. "I can't believe they'd leave something they prize as highly as that trophy in an unlocked, unguarded building." "It's not unguarded," she smiled. "There are no guards in the building. There is, however, a silent alarm that will summon guards. It's triggered by the nightingale floor." "The what?" I interrupted. "The nightingale floor," she repeated. "The wooden floor around the trophy is riddled with deliberately loosened boards that creak when you step on them. In this case, they not only creak, they trip an alarm." "Wonderful," I grimaced. "So we can't set foot in the room we're supposed to steal something out of. Anything else?" "Just the magical wards around the statue itself," she shrugged. "Magical wards?" I gulped. "The wards are sloppy. Someone set up a fence instead of a dome when they cast the wards. All you have to do is levitate the trophy over the wards and float it across the floor into our waiting arms. We never even have to set foot in the room." "Whoa," I cautioned, holding up a hand. "There's one problem with that. I can't do it." "You can't?" She blinked. "I thought levitation was one of your strongest spells." "It is," I conceded, "but that statue's heavy. I couldn't levitate it from a distance. I'd have to be close, practically standing on top of it." "Okay," she said at last. "We'll just have to switch to Plan B." "You have a Plan B?" I asked, genuinely impressed. "Sure," she grinned. "I just made it up. You can fly us both across the floor and over the wards. Then we latch onto the trophy and fly back to Klah from inside the wards." "I don't know," I frowned. "Now what's wrong?" My guide scowled. "Well, flying's a form of levitation," I explained. "I've never tried flying myself and someone else, and even if I can do it, we'll be pushing down on the floor as hard as if we were walking on it. It might set the alarm off." "Okay, here's what we'll do," she exclaimed, leaning forward. "You fly across to the trophy alone while I wait by the door. Then, when you're in place, You can use the D-hopper to bring yourself and the trophy back to Klah, while I blip back magically. A group of 12 cloaked figures appeared from the shadows beside the building. They looked briefly up and down the street, then turned and disappeared into the building. "I thought you said there wouldn't be any guards in the building," I whispered frantically. "I don't understand it," Tanda murmured, more to herself than to me. "It's not laid out for a guard force." The group re-emerged from the building. Moving more slowly than when we had first seen them, they edged their way back into the shadows and vanished from sight. "That's a relief," Tanda declared. "It's time we got this show on the road. Follow me." Needless to say, I didn't want to go, but I was even more reluctant to be left behind. "In you go," Tanda ordered, holding the door open. "Be sure to sing out when you're in position." I reached out with my mind and pushed gently against the floor. As had happened 100 times in practice, I lifted free and began to float toward the estimated position of the statue. I freed part of my mind from the task of flying and cast about in front of me, seeking the telltale aura of the magical wards. There were none. "Tanda," I hissed, speaking before I thought. "The wards are down." "Impossible," came her response from the door. "You must be in the wrong spot. Check again." "There are no wards," I called softly. "I'm right over the pedestal, and there are no wards." "If you're over the pedestal," Tanda called, "then drop down and get the trophy. And hurry, I think I hear someone coming." I lowered myself to the floor, gently as I remembered the creaky boards, and turned to the pedestal. "It's gone!" I cried. "What?" Tanda gasped, her silhouette appearing in the doorway. "The trophy! It's gone!" I exclaimed, running my hands over the vacant pedestal. "Get out, Skeeve!" Tanda called, suddenly full volume. I started for the door, but her voice stopped me. "No! Use the D-hopper! Now!" My thumb went to the activator button on the device I had been clutching, but I hesitated. "What about you?" I called. "Aren't you coming?" "After you're gone," she insisted. "Now get go—" Something came flying out of the dark and struck her silhouette. She went down in a boneless heap. "Tanda!" I shouted, starting forward. Suddenly the doorway was filled with short silhouettes, swarming all over Tananda's prone form. I wavered for a moment in indecision. "There's another one inside," someone called. So much for indecision. I hit the button. There was the now familiar rush of darkness, and I was back in my quarters on Klah. Aahz was seated at a table with his back to me, but he must have heard the bamf of my arrival.
"It's about time," he growled. "Did you enjoy your little—"
"Aahz!" I cried, stumbling forward. "We're in trouble." His fist came down in a crash which splintered the table.
"I knew it," he snarled. "Now, let's see if I've got this straight," Aahz grumbled, pacing the length of the room. "You got away without a scratch, but Tanda got caught, right?"
"I couldn't help it," I moaned, shaking my head. "They were all over her, and you said—"
I know, my mentor waved. "You did the right thing. I'm just trying to get a clear picture of the situation. You sure this was in Jahk? The weird dimension with the short, pale guys? Skinny or overweight?"
"That's right," I confirmed. "Do you know it?"
"I've heard of it," Aahz shrugged, "but I've never gotten around to visiting. It's talked around a bit on the gambling circuit."
"Must be because of the big game," I suggested brightly.
Aahz sighed. "I want you to think hard. You sure you don't know who jumped her, or why?"
Well, I began, clearing my throat. I'm not sure, but I think the ones who grabbed Tanda were the city guardsmen.
Guardsmen? Aahz frowned. Oh, why would they want to put the grab on Tanda? All you were doing was a little shopping.
I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come.
What were you doing? Aahz growled. Come on now, out with it. I should have known it wasn't just... Hey, you didn't kill anyone, did you?
Strong hands closed on my shoulders, and my head was tossed about by a none too gentle shaking.
We didn't kill anyone,
I shouted, the process difficult because my jaw was moving in a different direction than my tongue.
We were just stealing... Stealing?
The hands on my shoulders released their grip so fast I fell to the floor. Fortunately, I had the presence of mind to break my fall with my rump.
I don't believe it. Stealing?
Aahz made his appeal to the ceiling.
All this because you tried to steal something.
My rump hurt, but I had other more pressing matters to deal with. I was desperately trying to phrase my explanation when I realized with some astonishment that Aahz was laughing.
Stealing, he repeated. You know, you really had me going for a minute there, kid. Stealing. And I thought it was something important.
You mean you aren't mad? I asked incredulously.
Mad? Nah, he proclaimed. Like the old saying goes, you can take the boy out of thieving. Heck, most demons are thieves. It's the only way to get something if you don't have any native coinage.
I thought you'd really be upset, I stammered, still unwilling to believe my good fortune.
So, let's see it.
He smiled, extending a palm. See what? I blinked. Actually, I gulped, avoiding his eyes again. That is, we didn't get it. It's still back in Jahk somewhere.
You mean to say you went through all this hassle, got Tanda captured, and came running back here with your tail between your legs and you didn't even bother to pick up what you were trying to steal?
The storm clouds were back in Aahz's face. He dragged up a chair and sat in front of me, leaving me little option but to narrate the whole story.
Well, it should have worked, Aahz admitted. The only thing I can figure out is that they moved your target somewhere else for safekeeping. But that doesn't make sense. I mean, why would they set up all the security arrangements if the target was going to be kept somewhere else?
I don't know, Aahz, I said. The whole city seemed pretty worked up over the trophy.
Trophy?
Aahz interrupted.
You mean the trophy from the big game? Well, what has that got to do with anything?
That's what we were trying to steal, I explained.
The trophy?
Aahz exclaimed.
You two didn't aim small, didn't you? What did you want to do with... No, on second thought, don't tell me. That woman's logic always makes my head hurt.
I'm afraid they might execute her, I pressed, secretly relieved at not having to disclose the motive for our theft.
Well, it's a possibility, Aahz admitted, but I still think they'd let her wake up first.
Aahz, I shouted.
What is it?
I just remembered. I was handling our disguises for the whole trip. If I'm here, and Tanda's unconscious in Jahk, then she hasn't got a disguise. They'll be able to see she isn't one of them, that she's a demon. There was a frozen moment of silence. Then Aahz was on his feet, looming over me.
Don't just sit there, kid, he growled. Get the D-hopper. We're going to Jahk.
Our subsequent arrival at Jahk was smooth and uneventful. In hindsight, I realized that this was the last thing to go right for some time.
Well, kid,
Aahz exclaimed, looking about him eagerly,
where do we go?
I don't know, I admitted, scanning the horizon. When Tanda and I arrived, We were in a park in Ta-hoe. At the moment, Aahz and I were standing beside a dirt road, surrounded by gently rolling meadows and a scattering of very strange trees.
Okay, so the D-hopper's set for a different drop zone than the one Tanda uses. We'll just have to dig up a native guide to get us oriented.
Terrific, I grimaced. And where are we supposed to find a native guide?
How about right over there?
Aahz smirked, pointing. I followed the line of his extended talon. Sure enough, not a stone's throw away was a small pond huddled in the shade of a medium-sized tree. Seated, leaning against the tree, was a young native. I started forward, only to be stopped short by Aahz's heavy hand on my shoulder.
Kid, he sighed, aren't you forgetting something?
What? I blinked.
Our disguises, dummy,
he snarled. Embarrassed by the oversight, I hastily did my disguise bit, and together we approached the dozing native. Excuse me, sir, I began, clearing my throat. Can you tell us the way to Ta-hoe? What are you doing out here? The youth demanded without opening his eyes. Don't you know the land between Vegas and Ta-hoe is a no-man's land until the war's over?
What did he say?
Aahz scowled. What was that? The youth asked, his eyes snapping open. For a change, my mind grasped the situation instantly. I was wearing my translator pendant from my travels with Tanda, but Aahz didn't have one. That meant that while I could understand and be understood by both Aahz and the native, neither of them could decipher what the other was saying. Our disguise was in danger of being discovered by the first native we'd met on our rescue mission. Terrific. Excuse me a moment, sir, I stammered at the youth. Thinking fast, I removed the pendant from around my neck and looped it over my arm. Aahz understood at once and thrust his hand through the pendant, grasping my forearm with an iron grip. Thus, we were both able to utilize the power of the pendant. Right, I said. What was that you were saying about a war? I was saying you shouldn't be here, the youth replied. Both sides have declared this area off-limits to civilians until after the war's over. When did this war start? I asked. Oh, it won't actually start for a week or so, the native shrugged. We haven't had a war for over 500 years, and everyone's out of practice. It'll take them a while to get ready. But you still shouldn't be here.
Well, what are you doing here? Aahz challenged. You don't look like a soldier to me.
My dad's an officer, the youth yawned. If a Ta-hoe patrol finds me out here, I'll just tell them who my father is, and they'll keep their mouths shut. Well, what if a patrol from Vegas finds you? I asked curiously. The Vegans? He laughed incredulously. They're even more unprepared than Ta-hoe is. They haven't even got their uniforms designed yet, much less organized enough to send out patrols.
Well, we appreciate the information, Aahz announced. Now, if you'll just point out the way to Ta-hoe, we'll get ourselves off your battlefield.
The way to Ta-hoe? The youth frowned. You don't know the way to Ta-hoe? That's strange.
Well, what's strange? My mentor challenged.
It's strange, he observed calmly, because that road only runs between Vegas and Ta-hoe. Perhaps you can explain how it is that you're traveling a road without knowing either where you're going or where you're coming from.
Well, the explanation is really quite simple, Aahz smiled. You see, we're magicians who just dropped in from another world. We've come to offer our services to the glorious city of Ta-hoe for the upcoming war.
Magicians? He smiled skeptically. You don't look like magicians to me.
Show 'em, kid, Aahz instructed.
Show him?
That's right, my mentor nodded. Drop the disguises, one at a time.
With a shrug, I slipped my arm back into the translator pendant and let my disguise fall away. I am Skeeve, I announced. And this, I dropped Aahz's disguise, is my friend and fellow magician, Aahz. The effect on the youth couldn't have been greater if we had lit a fire under him. His eyes were wide with fright, and his mouth kept opening and shutting, though no sounds came forth.
Well, that's enough, kid, Aahz winked. He's convinced.
I hastily reassembled the disguises, but it did little to calm the youth. The youth stammered. Then he paused and set his lips. Ta-hoe's that way.
Thanks, I smiled. We'll be on our way now. Not so fast, kid, Aahz waved. What's your name, son?
Griffin, sir, the youth replied uneasily.
Well, Griffin, Aahz smiled, how would you like to show us the way?
I'd rather not,
Griffin began. Of course, Aahz interrupted. Well, we could kill him here and now.
I insist you let me escort you, the youth proclaimed.
Welcome, comrade, I beamed.
I hope you won't hold it against me if your services aren't accepted, the youth frowned. You see, well, we already have a magician.
Is that all? Aahz laughed. Just leave him to us.
When Aahz says us in regard to magic, he means me. However bad things had gone so far, I had an uncomfortable foreboding. They were going to get worse. Ta-hoe was a beehive of activity when we arrived. The citizens were busily producing pennants, posters, and lightweight shirts with "Win the War" emblazoned across them. "It's the biggest thing to hit Ta-hoe in my lifetime," our guide confided. "This war thing caught everybody flat-footed. A lot of people are complaining that they weren't given sufficient warning to cash in on it. There's a resolution before the council right now to postpone hostilities for another month." Aahz was enthralled.
These folks really know how to run a war, he declared with undisguised enthusiasm. Most dimensions make their war profits off munitions and weapons contracts. I'll tell you, kid, if we weren't in such a hurry, I'd take notes.
For a moment, our path was blocked by a crowd listening to a young rabble-rouser who spoke to them from atop a jury-rigged platform. "I tell you, the council is withholding information from us." A growl arose from the assemblage. "How are we supposed to set the odds for this war, much less bet intelligently, if we don't know the facts?" The crowd was nearing frenzied hysterics as we finally edged past. Who are these people?" I asked. "Bookies," Griffin shrugged. "The council had better watch its step. They're one of the strongest lobbies in Ta-hoe."
Say, Griffin, Aahz called, I've been meaning to ask, what started the war anyway?
"Those bastards from Vegas stole our trophy," he snarled angrily. "Now we're going to get it back, or know the reason why."
Stole your trophy, eh? My mentor commented innocently. Know how they did it?
"A pack of 'em pulled a hit-and-run raid the day after the big game," Griffin proclaimed bitterly. "They struck just after sundown and got away before the guardsmen could respond to the alarm." The memory of the group entering and leaving the trophy building while Tanda and I waited flashed across my mind. "Our security precautions on the trophy were more than adequate," our guide announced levelly, "under normal circumstances. The thieves had magical assistance." "Magical assistance?" I said. "We actually captured the demon that helped them." For a long moment there was silence. Neither Aahz nor I wanted to ask the next question. Finally Aahz spoke.
A demon, you say? he asked, smiling his broadest. "What happened to it?"
"Oh, the magician's holding it captive. Maybe he'll let you see it when you meet him," he announced, pointing at a door in the wall. "The magician lives there." Just then, the door opened, exposing a wizened old man who blinked at the sunlight.
"Griffin!" he exclaimed. "What brings you here?"
"Well, sir," our guide stammered, that is, there are two gentlemen who want to speak with you. They say, well, they're magicians."
"Magicians, you say? Well, come right in, gentlemen. Lad, I think you'd better wait outside here. Professional secrets and all that, you know." I tried to hide my nervousness as we followed the magician into his abode. "Aahz," I whispered, "have you got a fix on this guy yet?" "Well, it's a little early to say," my mentor replied sarcastically. "In the meantime, I've got a little assignment for you."
"Like what?"
"Like, check his aura. Now."
One of the first things I had learned from Aahz was how to check auras, the field of magic around people or things. It seemed a strange thing to do just now, but I complied, viewing our host with unfocused eyes. "Aahz," I gasped. "He's got an aura. The man's actually radiating magic. I can't do anything against someone that powerful."
"Now, it's possible there's another explanation, kid," Aahz murmured. "He could be wearing a disguise spell like we are."
"Do you think so?" I asked hopefully.
"Well," my mentor drawled, "he's wearing a translator pendant, the same as we are. That makes it a good bet that he's not from this dimension. Besides, there's something familiar about his voice."
Our conversation ground to a halt as we reached our destination, a small room sparsely furnished with a large table surrounded by several chairs.
"If you'll be seated, gentlemen," our host said, gesturing to the chairs, "perhaps you'll be good enough to tell me what it is you wish to speak to me about." "Not so fast," Aahz challenged, holding up a hand. "We're used to knowing who we're dealing with. Could you do us the courtesy of removing your disguise before we start?"
The magician averted his eyes and began to fidget nervously.
"Oh, you spotted it, eh?" he grumbled. "No, it figures. As you've probably guessed already, I'm relatively new to this profession. Not in your class at all, if you know what I mean."
An immense wave of relief washed over me, but Aahz remained skeptical.
"Just take off the disguise, huh?" he insisted.
"Oh, very well," our host sighed and began fumbling in his pocket.
We waited patiently until he found what he was looking for. Then the lines of his features began to waver. His body grew taller and fuller, until at last we saw...
"I thought so," Aahz crowed triumphantly.
"Quigley!" I gasped.
"This is embarrassing," the demon hunter grumbled, slouching down into his chair.
Physically, Quigley was unchanged from when we first met him. Tall, long-boned, and muscular, he still looked as if he'd be more at home in armor, swinging a sword, than sitting around in magician robes sipping wine with us.
"I was afraid you two would be along when I realized it was Tanda the gods captured," the ex-demon hunter grumbled. "My magical powers don't hold a candle next to yours. I know full well that now that you're here, you'll be able to take my job away from me without much difficulty. Either that, or make me look silly in front of my employers, so that they'll fire me outright."
"Oh, that's ridiculous," I cried, more than slightly offended. "Look, Quigley, I promise you we'll neither steal your job nor make you look silly while we're here."
"Really?"
Quigley asked, brightening noticeably.
You're being a little hasty with your promises, aren't you, kid?
Aahz interrupted. "Ah, come on, Aahz," I grimaced. "You know that isn't why we're here."
But, kid...
I ignored him, turning back to Quigley. "I promise you, Quigley, no job stealing and nothing that will endanger your position. The truth is, I've already got a magician's job of my own. I'm surprised Tanda hasn't told you."
"Well, actually, lad," he murmured uncomfortably, "Tanda hasn't said anything since she was turned over to my custody."
"She hasn't?" I asked, surprised. "That's funny. Usually the trouble is getting her to stop talking."
"Quite right," Quigley laughed uneasily. "Except this time, well, she hasn't regained consciousness yet."
You mean she's still out cold?
Aahz exclaimed, surging to his feet.
Well, why didn't you say so? Come on, Quigley, wheel her out here. This might be serious.
No, you misunderstand," Quigley waved. "She hasn't regained consciousness because I've kept a sleep spell on her. If I let her wake up, well, I don't flatter myself about my powers. There would be nothing I could do to keep her from escaping."
"You don't want her to escape?" I blinked.
"Of course not. It would mean my job," Quigley smiled. "That's why I'm so glad you promised not to do anything that would jeopardize my position."
My stomach sank. Aahz roared, slapping his hand down on the table hard enough to make the chairs jump.
I tell you, she didn't steal the damn trophy.
Quigley frowned.
"What's important is the council believes Tanda was involved, and they wouldn't even consider releasing her unless they got the trophy back first. With the trophy back, the council would be ecstatic and definitely better disposed towards Tanda. Yes, if the trophy were returned, I think I could find an excuse to release her."
"Is that a promise?" I may be ignorant, but I'm a fast learner. Quigley studied me for a moment before answering.
"Very well," he said at last. "Why do you ask?"
I shot a glance at Aahz. One eyelid slowly closed in a wink, then he went back to studying the ceiling. "Because," I announced, relief flooding over me, "I think I've come up with a way we can free Tanda, protect your job, and stop the war all in one fell swoop."
Steal the trophy back from Vegas, huh? Just like that, Aahz grumbled for the 100th time.
"We're doomed,"
Griffin prophesied grimly. "Oh, shut up, Griffin," I snarled.
"But I keep telling you, I don't know Vegas," the youth protested. "I won't be any help at all. Please, can't I go back to Ta-hoe?"
We've gone over this before, my mentor sighed. This heist is going to be rough enough without Vegas hearing about it in advance. Now, the only way we can be sure you don't tell anyone is to keep you with us. Besides, you're our passport through the Ta-hoe patrols if we meet any. We won't be able to make any firm plans until we see the layout and size up the guards. How about it, Griffin? What are we liable to be up against? How good are these Vegans?
"The Vegans?" our guide grimaced. "I wouldn't worry about them if I were you. They couldn't guard a pea if they swallowed it."
Well, they stole the trophy right out from under your noses, my mentor pointed out. It sounds to me like they may not be as inept as you'd like to think they are.
"They get lucky once in a while," Griffin muttered darkly.
Aside from the military, what are we up against? My mentor asked. Do they have a magician?
"They sure do," Griffin nodded vigorously. "Her name's Marcia. She used to be Ta-hoe's magician until Vegas hired her away. I used to run errands for her, and—" He suddenly stopped in mid-stride and mid-sentence simultaneously. "Hey, that's right," he exclaimed. "I can't go along with you if you're going to see Marcia. She knows me. If the Vegans find out I'm from Ta-hoe, they'll think I'm a scout. I'd get torn apart." I thought Aahz was going to pull me aside for a private conversation, but instead he simply slipped off his translator pendant. After a bit of browbeating,
Quigley had supplied us with an extra, so now we each had one. Removing them allowed us to converse without fear of being overheard, while at the same time keeping Griffin within arm's length. I followed suit and removed mine. "What gives, Aahz?" I asked.
Look, Aahz gritted. We're going to have our hands full trying to elude the military and this Masha gal without trying to keep an eye on Griffin, too. He can't be any great help to us, and if he isn't a help, he's a hindrance.
"Okay," I sighed, "but what do we do with him?"
Well, that's easy, Aahz shrugged. You put a sleep spell on him.
"Aahz," I said gently, closing my eyes, "I don't know how to cast a sleep spell. Remember?"
Well, that's no problem, my mentor winked. I'll teach you. It's more like suspended animation.
"Like what?" I blinked.
It's a magical slowing of the body's metabolism, he clarified helpfully. If it were sleep as you perceive it, then you'd run into problems of dehydration and...
"Aahz," I interrupted, holding up a hand, "is the spell easier than the explanation?"
Well, yes, he admitted.
"Then just teach me the spell, okay?" Fortunately, the sleep spell was as easy to learn as Aahz had promised, and we left Griffin snoozing peacefully in a patch of weeds along the road. We took the precaution of circling Vegas to enter the city from a direction other than Ta-hoe. Everyone in Vegas was too busy with their own business to even notice us, much less which direction we were coming from. The war activities in Vegas were the same as we had witnessed in Ta-hoe, except the souvenirs were being made in red and white instead of blue and gold. I was starting to wonder if anyone was ever going to get around to actually fighting the war, or if they were all too busy making money. "Look at that, Aahz!" I exclaimed, pointing. There was a small crowd gathered, listening to a noisy orator. From what I could hear, their complaint was the same one we had heard back in Ta-hoe, that the government's withholding information about the war was hampering the Oddsmakers.
Yeah? So?
My mentor shrugged. "I wonder if they're bookies, too," I speculated.
There's one way to find out,
Aahz offered. Before I could reply, he had sauntered over to someone at the back of the crowd and engaged him in an animated conversation. There was nothing for me to do but wait and worry.
"Good news, kid," he beamed, rejoining me at last.
"Tell me," I pressed. "I could use some good news right about now."
"They're giving 3-to-1 odds against Ta-hoe in the upcoming war."
"That's it?" I frowned. "That's your good news? It sounds to me like we've badly underestimated Vegas's military strength."
"Relax, kid," Aahz soothed. "Those are the same odds they're offering in Ta-hoe against Vegas. Local bookies always have to weigh the odds in favor of a home team. Otherwise, no one will bet against them."
"Okay, so they're actually evenly matched," I shrugged. "I still don't see how that's good news for us."
"Don't you see?" my mentor urged. "That means the bookies are operating independently instead of as a combine. If we play our cards right, we could show a hefty profit from this mess."
"By betting?" I asked. "How would we know which side to bet for?"
"Not bet for, bet against," Aahz explained. "And we'd bet equal amounts against both sides."
"I don't get it," I admitted. "Betting the same amount for... against both sides. All we do is break even." Aahz rolled his eyes in exasperation.
"Think it through, kid," he insisted. "At 3-to-1 odds, we can't do anything but win. Say we bet 1,000 against each team. If Ta-hoe wins, then we pay 1,000 in Ta-hoe and collect 3,000 in Vegas for a net profit of 2,000. If Vegas wins, we reverse the process and still come out 2,000 ahead."
"Oh, that's not a bad plan," I said judiciously. "But I can see 3 things wrong with it. First, we don't have 1,000 with us to bet."
"We can hop back to Klah and get it," Aahz countered.
"Second, We don't have the time.
It wouldn't take that long,
my mentor protested. Third, if our mission's successful, there won't be a war. Aahz's mouth was open for a response, and that's where it stayed, open and blissfully noiseless, as he thought about my argument.
Got you there, didn't I, Aahz?
I grinned.
I wonder what the odds are that there won't be a war,
he mused, casting a wistful eye at the crowd of bookies. Come on, Aahz, I sighed, tugging bravely at his arm. We've got a heist to scout.
First, he corrected firmly, we have to check out this Masha character.
We picked our way across Vegas, occasionally stopping people to ask directions, and arrived at last outside the dwelling of the town magician. Aahz grinned.
Just remember to check her aura as soon as we get inside. It'll help to know if she's local or if we're dealing with imported help.
So saying, he raised his hand and began rapping on the door. I say began because between the second and third rap, the door flew open with alarming speed.
What are you, well, hello there, boys. Are you Masha the magician?
Aahz stammered, both taken aback and stepping back.
Can you imagine anyone else fitting the description?
Came the throaty chuckle in response. Masha was immense, in girth if not in height. She filled the doorway to overflowing, and it wasn't that narrow a door. Still, size alone doth not a pageant make. Masha might have been overlooked as just another large woman, were it not for her garments. Purple and green warred with each other across her tent-like dress, and her bright orange hair, draped across one shoulder in dirty strings, did nothing toward encouraging an early settlement. And jewelry! Masha was wearing enough in the way of earrings, rings, and necklaces to open her own store. She wasn't a sample case. She was the entire inventory. Her face was nothing to write home about, unless you're really into depressing letters. Bad teeth were framed by fleshy, chapped lips, and her pig-like eyes, peering from the depths of her numerous smile wrinkles, were difficult to distinguish from her other skin blemishes. I've seen some distinctive-looking women in my travels, but Masha took the cake, platter, and tablecloth.
Did you boys just come to stare? The apparition asked. Or can I do something for you? Well, we need help,
Aahz managed.
Well, you came to the right place,
Masha leered.
Step into my parlor and we'll discuss what I've got that you want, and vice versa.
Aahz followed her into the building, leaving me no choice but to trail along. I hurriedly checked for magical emanations.
She's got... No, wait a minute, I whispered. It isn't her. It's her jewelry. It's magical, but she isn't. I thought so, Aahz nodded. Okay, now we know what we're dealing with.
We do? I asked.
She's a mechanic,
my mentor explained hurriedly.
Gimmick magic with a jewelry.
Any further questions I might have had were forgotten as we arrived at our destination. Having just left Quigley's dwelling, I was unprepared for what Masha used for an office. To say it was a bedroom would be an understatement. It was the gaudiest collection of tassels, pillows, and erotic statues I had seen this side of the bazaar at Deva.
Sit down, boys,
Masha smiled, sinking into the parade ground-sized bed.
Take off your things, and we'll get started.
My life flashed before my eyes. While I had secretly dreamed of a career as a ladies' man, I had never envisioned it starting like this. If I had, I might have become a monk. Even Aahz, with his vast experience, seemed at a loss.
Actually, he protested, we don't have much time. You misunderstand me, Masha waved, fanning the air with a massive hand. What I meant was, take off your disguises.
Our disguises? I blurted, swallowing hard. In reply, she held aloft her left hand, the index finger extended for us to see. The it was the fourth ring, was blinking a brilliant purple.
This little toy says you're not only magicians, you're disguised, she grinned. Now, I'm as sociable as the next person, but I like to see who I'm doing business with. In fact, I insist.
As she spoke, the door behind us slammed shut and locked with an audible click. So much for our big advantage.
With your permission, dear lady,
making a half bow at Masha, Aahz began making a series of graceful passes with his hand in the air in front of him. It was very puzzling. Aahz had lost all his magical powers back when... Then it hit me. Masha thought we were both magicians. Aahz was trying to maintain the illusion and could very well pull it off if I got busy and backed his move. As inconspicuously as possible, I closed my eyes and got to work stripping away his disguise.
a pervert.
Masha crowed in tribute to my efforts.
Actually, Aahz corrected smoothly, as a native of Perv, I prefer to be called a pervect. I don't care what you call yourself, she winked lewdly. I'm more interested in how you act.
I was just beginning to enjoy my mentor's discomfort when Masha turned her attentions on me.
How about you, sport? She pressed. You don't say much. Let's see what you're hiding.
I resisted an impulse to clutch wildly at my clothes and instead set about restoring my normal appearance.
Ah, a clod. And a young one at that, Masha proclaimed, cocking her head as she examined me. Well, no matter. By the time old Masha's through with you... Say!
Her eyes suddenly opened wide, and her gaze darted to Aahz, then back to me.
A clod traveling with a pervert? Your name wouldn't be Skeeve, would it?
You've heard of me? I blinked, both startled and flattered.
Well, if you know Skeeve here,
Aahz smiled, elbowing his way into the conversation,
then surely you know who I am. As a matter of fact, I don't,
Masha shrugged. In that case, I interrupted hastily, allow me to introduce my friend and colleague, Aahz.
So, what are a pair of big leaguers like you doing in Jahk?
Masha asked, leaning back into her silken pillows.
Well, we're just on a little vacation, Aahz lied, and dropped by Jahk to try to make some of our money back in the gambling set.
Gambling? Masha frowned. But the big game is over.
The big game, Aahz snorted. I'll level with you. We don't know enough about spectator sports to bet on them, but we do know wars. And we hear there's one brewing. What we'd like is a little inside information as to how much of a hand you expect to have in the proceedings, and if you expect any trouble with the opposition. The opposition? You mean Ta-hoe's magician?
She threw back her head and laughed.
I guarantee you, boys, I can handle, what's-his-name, Quigley, with one hand. That is, of course, providing that one hand is armed with a few of my toys.
She wiggled her fingers to illustrate her point.
Well, that's fine for the war, Aahz nodded. But how about here in town? What's to keep Ta-hoe from stealing the trophy back before the war?
Oh, I've got a few gizmos over at the trophy building that'll fry anyone who tries to heist it, especially if they try to use magic.
Sounds good, my mentor smiled, though I noticed it was a little forced. As long as you have total control on the trophy's security, it isn't likely anything will go wrong.
Not total control, Masha corrected.
The Army's responsible for it when it's on parade.
Parade? I blurted.
What parade? Oh, once a day they carry the trophy through the streets to keep the citizens fired up. You'd think they'd get tired of it, but so far everyone goes screaming bonkers every time it comes in view. I assume it has a military escort, Aahz commented. Are you kidding? Half the Army tags along when it does the rounds. They spend more time escorting that trophy around than they do drilling for the war. Did you know Quigley has summoned up a demon to help him? Aahz asked.
A demon, huh? Masha muttered softly, staring absently at the far wall.
Well, what do you know? I didn't think Quigley had it in him. I think we can get the demon away from Quigley, or at least neutralize it so it won't help him at all, Aahz said.
You'd do that for me? As a favor? Masha blinked.
Sure, Aahz waved. Just don't be surprised at anything we do, and whatever you do, don't try to counter any of our moves. I won't make any guarantees, but I think we can pull it off. If we do, just remember, you owe us a favor someday.
Anyone who knew Aahz would have been immediately suspicious if he offered to do anything as a favor. Fortunately, Masha didn't know Aahz, and she seemed both solicitous and grateful as she waved goodbye to us at the door.
Well, kid, Aahz grinned, slapping me on the back, big bad Masha won't move against us no matter what we do, for fear of disrupting our plans against Quigley. The mission's still on. We're gonna steal the trophy.
But I can't bypass Masha's traps at the trophy building.
Of course not, Aahz agreed. That's why we're gonna steal it from the parade. Don't you see, kid? The reason it's a perfect situation is that everyone's sure it can't be stolen.
A roar went up from the crowd around us, ending any hope for conversation. The trophy was just coming into view. We had chosen our post carefully. This point was the closest the procession came to the north wall of Vegas, and hence it was the closest the trophy came to the gate opening onto the road to Ta-hoe. In line with Aahz's plan, we waved our fists in the air and jumped up and down as the trophy passed by with its military escort.
So far, so good,
Aahz murmured, scanning the backs in front of us to be sure we were unobserved. Maybe we should quit while we're ahead, I suggested hopefully.
Shut up and start working,
he snapped back in a tone that left no room for argument. With an inward sigh, I closed my eyes and began making subtle changes in our disguises. By the time I was done, we not only looked like jocks, we were dressed in the uniform of Vegan soldiers.
Good enough, kid,
Aahz growled, clapping me on the shoulder.
Let's go.
With that, he plunged headlong into the crowd, clearing a path for me to emerge on the street behind the trophy procession.
Make way, he bawled. One side, make way.
Tahoe'as, I called, at the south wall. Tahoe'as. For a moment, no one seemed to hear us. Then a few heads turned. A couple of voices took up my call. Tahoe'as, they cried. We're being attacked. The word spread through the crowd ahead of us like wildfire. Tahoe'as, I shouted, pushing in among them. Where? The south wall. Where? The south wall. Who? Tahoe'as. Where? This nonsense might have continued endlessly, except for the appearance of an officer on the scene. He was noticeably more intelligent than the soldiers around him, which was to say, he might have won a debate with a turnip.
What's going on here?
He demanded. "Tahoe'as, sir," I gasped, still a bit out of breath from my performance. "They're attacking in force at the south wall."
The south wall? The officer frowned. But Ta-hoe is north of here.
"Well, they must have circled around the city," I suggested hastily. "They're attacking the south wall." Drawing his sword, he turned to the men around him.
"To the south wall," he ordered. "Follow me. To the south wall!"
The cry went up as the soldiers wheeled and dashed back down the street. A dozen soldiers were still clustered around the trophy, its litter now resting on the ground. "What are we going to do, Aahz?" I hissed.
"I want you to change my face and uniform to match that officer we talked to."
In a moment, the necessary adjustments were made, and my mentor was on his way, striding angrily toward the remaining soldiers.
"Citizens of Rgeous," Aahz boomed, "our fair city is under attack. Now, I know all of you will want to volunteer to help the army in this battle, but to be effective, you must be disciplined and orderly. To that end, I want all volunteers to line up here in front of me for instructions. Any who are unable to serve should return to their homes at this time, so the militia will have room to maneuver. All right. Volunteers, assemble."
Within seconds, Aahz and I were left alone in the street. The crowd of potential volunteers had evaporated like water spilled on a hot griddle. "Where'd they all go?" I asked, craning my neck to look around.
"Home, of course," Aahz smirked. "No one likes the draft, particularly when it affects them personally."
I wet my finger and tested the breeze. "There's not that much wind today," I announced suspiciously.
"Look, let's just grab the trophy, okay?" he snarled. "That south wall bit won't fool the army forever, and I, for one, don't want to be here when they get back."
With that, he strode over to the trophy and simply picked it up and tucked it under his arm, balancing it casually on his hip. "How are we going to get it past the guards at the north gate?" I blurted.
"What's that?" Aahz frowned.
"They aren't going to let us just walk past them carrying that trophy, and I can't disguise it. It's a medal."
"You're right, kid," my mentor nodded thoughtfully. "Oh, well, we're just going to have to do this the fast way. Break out the D-hopper."
I hurriedly fumbled the D-hopper out of my pouch and passed it to Aahz for setting. I crouched